When the drone first scratched away the surface of the moon, the dust fell in a strange way as though resisting the action. That wasn't right. Lunar dust doesn't fall like that. It floats, it billows, it doesn't resist gravity. But there it was, drifting up and settling against the drone's treads in odd swirls. I should have backed away, but we were so close. The moon was dead. It was sterile, lifeless. So we thought. But when that crystal-like surface appeared beneath the layers of dust, I could feel something shift, like the entire place was waking up. I've been with the reclamation program long enough to know that when the ground underfoot begins to feel off, you stop. But no one listened. Dr. Adrian Hayes, the archaeologist on site, was the first to touch the artifact. I watched as his gloved hand made contact with the edge of the smooth, transparent crystal. He muttered something about its structure, its form. I thought it was just a piece of abandoned technology, an ancient artifact from the Apollo missions, perhaps. But the signal it emitted was unlike anything we had ever seen. It wasn't just interference. It was a pattern, deliberate and structured. I thought it was a malfunction, just another glitch. I wanted to believe that. But deep down, something in me knew it was far worse. Ray Torres, the pilot on site, kept her distance. She'd been trained to deal with extreme situations, but when the pulse of energy hit, she backed off, watching the artifact warily. "We're not alone," she muttered, her voice tight with something I couldn't place. Fear? I wasn't sure. But when the moon started to hum, soft at first like a low vibration, it became undeniable. That was when I felt it. The sick, cold feeling in my stomach that told me everything we were about to unearth should have stayed buried. The moon was a quiet, empty place. For centuries, humanity had looked at it as nothing more than a barren rock in space, there for scientific observation and exploration, but devoid of any real significance. But now, as the lunar base hummed quietly around me, the stillness felt wrong. It was the kind of wrong that wormed its way into your thoughts, crawling behind your skull until you couldn't shake it. I had spent weeks on the surface before this mission, and never once had I felt this unease. But now, with the artifact exposed, the whole moon seemed to be holding its breath. Adrian was relentless. He was determined to understand what we had uncovered, though something told me that understanding might be the last thing we wanted to do. He'd spent his career studying ancient artifacts, but there was something different about this one. From the moment it had been unearthed, I could tell it wasn't just old, it was alien. The cavern system where we had made the discovery was quiet. Dust hung thick in the air, illuminated by the harsh white lights of the base. The walls around us were cracked and uneven, remnants of the moon's volatile history. It was a perfect place to hide an artifact, but it was too perfect, too hidden. As if someone, or something, had gone to great lengths to keep it buried. Ray stood near the entrance, watching the horizon beyond the cavern, her hand resting on her earphones. She had been listening to the communication feed from Earth, trying to keep us in contact with the outside world. She had been on edge ever since we exposed the crystal, though she hadn't said why. The radio was static at first, then strange feedback began to interfere with the signal. "I don't like this," she said, almost to herself, her fingers tapping at her earphones. "The signal's coming through in bursts, it's not normal." I didn't respond, I had the same feeling, but I was trying to focus on the task. We couldn't stop now, not after all the effort it had taken to find this. We were too close to a breakthrough, too close to understanding what this artifact was. If it had been left behind by an ancient civilization, maybe there was technology buried in it that could change everything. If it could help us unlock some new energy source, or data on a species we didn't even know existed. Adrian's voice interrupted my thoughts. "Look at this," he said, pointing toward the artifact. At first it seemed like nothing, just another strange reflection in the crystalline surface, but then I realized something. The light wasn't reflecting back at us. It was bending. Something in the surface was warping the way light behaved. The air felt suddenly heavier, thicker, as if the artifact were pulling at the very fabric of the space around us. Then came the first hum, software almost imperceptible, like a low-frequency vibration, just enough to tickle your ears. At first, I thought it was a malfunction with the equipment, but when I looked up at Adrian, I saw his face drain of color. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. The hum grew louder, shifting in pitch, until it seemed to reverberate in my chest. It wasn't just noise, it was a call. The very air felt alive with the sound. Ray stiffened, her eyes wide. "We need to get out of here, now." But Adrian didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the artifact, and his voice was barely a murmur. "It's alive. It's talking to us." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. But what did he mean by alive? It wasn't just a piece of ancient technology. It wasn't just a relic. There was something in it. Something that was reaching out. It was like the artifact was calling to something deeper than the moon. I took a cautious step forward, but Ray grabbed my arm. "No, don't. We shouldn't be here." Her fear was real now, palpable, and it spread to me like a disease. Something was wrong, and it wasn't just the artifact. It was this place, this lunar dust, the silence that enveloped us. Adrian's hand was hovering over the artifact again, his fingers twitching, as if he was about to make contact again. I wanted to stop him, to scream, but instead I stood frozen as the hum intensified, pressing on the edges of my thoughts. The humming intensified. It was no longer a soft vibration in the air. It was an oppressive force, like the entire cavern was alive, pulsing with energy. I could feel it in my fingertips, in my throat, in the pit of my stomach. The whole base seemed to resonate with it, and for the first time since I'd arrived on the moon, I felt truly vulnerable, like something was watching us, waiting. I couldn't shake Ray's warning. There was a rawness to her voice, a desperation that told me she was right. But Adrian wasn't listening. His fingers hovered just above the artifact, inches away from making contact once again. I could see it in his eyes. He was entranced. His entire body seemed drawn to it, like the artifact was a magnet pulling him in. "Adrian, don't!" I shouted, but it was too late. His fingers brushed the surface. The moment his hand made contact, the hum reached a deafening pitch. The floor beneath us trembled, the dust on the ground swirling in tight circles around the artifact. For a brief second, I thought the entire moon might crack open. I could hear something deep below us, a distant rumble, like tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface. The air grew thick, stifling, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The walls of the cavern seemed to warp, stretching and bending unnaturally, as if the space itself was being distorted. A strange light pulsed from the artifact, casting an eerie glow across the cavern. "Adrian, get away from it!" I yelled again, my voice strained. But he was lost in whatever was happening. His breath was shallow, his face pale, as if he was struggling to remain conscious. His hand gripped the artifact tightly now, his body shaking with the force of whatever it was doing to him. We need to pull him away," Ray said, her voice trembling. But she didn't move. Neither did I. We were both too stunned, too horrified by what was unfolding. I could see it now, the faint outlines of something beneath the surface of the artifact. It wasn't just a solid mass. It was shifting, moving. It was as if there was something inside the crystal, something alive, something that had been dormant for millennia and was now awakening. "Adrian!" I shouted, taking a step forward, but Ray held me back. "No, we don't know what's happening to him. We need to leave, now." But it was too late. Adrian's eyes were wide, his pupils dilated, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hand began to twitch uncontrollably. The light from the artifact flashed brighter, almost blinding, and then the hum stopped. Suddenly, like someone had turned off a switch. The silence that followed was deafening. Adrian collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his entire body trembling. I rushed to his side, but Ray stayed at a distance, her gaze fixed on the artifact with a look of pure fear. "What the hell was that?" I breathed, my voice shaking. Adrian's lips parted, and for a moment, I thought he might speak, but he only stared at the artifact, his eyes wide with terror. I don't know," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "But I saw something. something in it. Ray stepped closer, her eyes still fixed on the artifact. She looked pale, her lips trembling. "We have to go. This is getting out of hand." But Adrian didn't move. He was staring at the artifact like it was calling to him, urging him to uncover its secrets. His obsession had deepened, and it scared me more than anything else. I could see the madness in his eyes now, the same madness that had been in his voice when he first made contact with the artifact. Whatever it was, it had a hold on him, and I wasn't sure we could escape it. The silence that followed Adrian's collapse was thick, unsettling. We stood there, frozen, our hearts racing in sync with the low, pulsing hum that continued to echo in the back of my mind. The moon, that barren rock, had always felt distant, indifferent to human life. But now, in this cavern beneath its cold surface, it felt personal. It felt like we were intruding on something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. Adrian was still on his knees, his breath ragged, his eyes glazed over. His hands trembled as he reached out for the artifact again, his fingers brushing its surface once more. I wanted to scream at him to stop, to get away, but the words stuck in my throat. There was something hypnotic about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, as if guided by an invisible force. I couldn't help but wonder if this was what had been waiting all these centuries for someone to awaken it. "Adrian, please," I whispered, stepping closer, my voice strained. "We need to leave. This is not worth it." But he didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the artifact, his expression distant as if the world around him no longer existed. Ray, standing behind me, looked as terrified as I felt, but her fear was more palpable, more immediate. She was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling. "This is insane. We need to get back to the surface. Now. Whatever that thing is, it's not right." I glanced at her, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something in her eyes. Something beyond fear. Was it regret? Doubt? The same feeling had been gnawing at me since the moment we exposed the artifact, but I had pushed it aside. Now, with Adrian slipping further into his obsession, that feeling turned into cold dread. The air around us grew heavier, the temperature shifting slightly as the artifact continued to pulse. A strange low-frequency hum vibrated in my chest, each note sending shivers down my spine. I tried to pull Adrian away from it, but when my hand touched his shoulder, he flinched violently, almost knocking me off balance. "It's calling to me," he muttered under his breath, his words barely audible. "I can feel it. It's all connected." I didn't understand what he meant by that. The artifact wasn't supposed to be anything more than a relic, a piece of technology long forgotten. But now, with the vibrations in the air growing stronger, it felt like the artifact was more than just ancient. It was alive. But how could that be? What kind of technology could create a force so compelling, so overwhelming that it could possess a person? "Adrian, we need to get back to the base. We're not equipped to handle this," Ray said firmly, her voice no longer trembling. She was right. We had no idea what we were dealing with. I could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on us, suffocating us. The artifact wasn't just a beacon. It was something more. Something that had been dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. And that moment had come. I moved to pull Adrian away again, but this time he fought back. His hand shot out, gripping my wrist with a strength that was unnatural. "You don't understand," he hissed, his voice strained with something that sounded almost manic. "It's too late. We've already awakened it. There's no going back now." Suddenly, the cavern around us shifted. The walls began to glow faintly, casting an eerie, unnatural light across the stone. The air thickened even more, almost choking us with its weight. The hum grew louder, more insistent, like the artifact itself was calling out, sending out waves of energy into the surrounding space. Ray grabbed my arm, pulling me back, her face pale with fear. "This is it. We need to leave. If we don't..." But before she could finish, the ground shook beneath us, and the walls of the cavern shifted once more, as if something beneath was waking up, stretching. The entire cavern groaned, a deep resonating sound that rattled my bones. The artifact, the alien relic, wasn't just a signal. It wasn't just a calling device. It was the first step. It was the gateway. And I realized too late that whatever had been dormant beneath the surface was now stirring. "Adrian, we have to go," I said, my voice breaking. But he didn't respond. His hand was still clutching the artifact, his body trembling violently. And then, without warning, the crystal pulsed. One final deafening burst of light. The pulse of light from the artifact was blinding. It enveloped the cavern, searing through the air like a supernova trapped in the depths of the moon. My vision went white for a moment, and when the light finally faded, I could feel the change. The cavern around us was different, warped, as though the space itself had been stretched and twisted by the energy. It wasn't just a pulse. It was a wave, a ripple that tore through the very fabric of the environment. Adrian, still gripping the artifact with a kind of fervent devotion, was no longer human. His face had twisted with a mixture of terror and awe, his eyes wide and glazed over, the pupils dilated to an unnatural extent. He was still breathing, but it wasn't the same shallow, desperate gasps he had earlier. His breath was calm, steady, almost meditative. It was as though he had become one with the artifact, bound to it in ways that defied reason. I couldn't move. The pulse of light had left my limbs frozen, and the weight of the cavern, the distortion in the air, made it impossible to focus. Ray was still beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt, but her eyes were wide with horror. She could feel it too, the pressure building in the cavern, the overwhelming sense that something was coming, something far worse than we could comprehend. "We need to leave," Ray whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling hum that now filled the air. "We need to get out of here." I nodded in agreement, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I was paralyzed by the same force that had overtaken Adrian. The artifact wasn't just calling to him, it was calling to all of us, and I could feel it in every fiber of my being. The hum vibrated through my bones, sending tremors of fear and anticipation coursing through me. And then there was a sound. A deep, guttural growl that came from somewhere beneath the moon's surface. It wasn't a sound any of us had heard before. It was an ancient primal noise, the kind of sound that resonated in the depths of your soul. A reminder that we were not the first to walk this moon, nor would we be the last. Ray's grip tightened on my hand. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The growl grew louder, closer, echoing through the walls. I could feel it in my chest, like the very ground beneath us was shifting, stretching, preparing for something to emerge. And then I saw it, shifting shadows in the distance, moving faster than I could process. They weren't just shadows. They were forms, shapes, vague and amorphous, like something out of a nightmare. They seemed to be moving toward us, a collection of figures bound by the same pulse that had overtaken Adrian. I turned to Adrian, desperation in my voice. "We have to go now." I reached for his arm, trying to pull him away from the artifact, but his grip tightened, like steel. "No," he said softly, his voice almost reverent. "It's too late." The shapes in the distance were becoming clearer now. There were more of them. Figures that looked human, but with something wrong. Their features were distorted, their bodies shifting, as though their very existence was in flux. They moved like shadows cast by a distorted light, flickering and warping in ways that defied natural movement. They were coming for us. I could feel the ground tremble beneath my feet, a deep rumbling that seemed to shake the cavern to its core. The hum, now almost deafening, had turned into a full-blown roar, a sound so powerful it seemed to vibrate the very air around us. "Adrian!" I shouted again, but he didn't respond. His gaze remained locked on the artifact, his hands now pressed flat against its surface. I couldn't tell if he was aware of the shapes coming toward us, or if he was lost in whatever trance the artifact had put him in. I had no choice. I had to make a decision. "Ray! Get back to the surface," I yelled, pulling her with me toward the cavern's exit. But Ray didn't move. She was frozen, staring at the figures in the distance, her face pale with fear. "They're not human," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "There's something else." The figures were closer now, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were struggling to keep their form intact. They were circling around us, like predators closing in on their prey. I could feel the weight of their presence, the malevolent force that seemed to radiate from them. And then, one of them spoke. The voice was low, gravelly, like something that had been buried for centuries. It was barely a whisper, but it sent a shockwave of terror through me. "You shouldn't have come." I froze. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating like a bomb going off in my skull. My breath caught in my throat, and I realized that we were no longer just exploring a forgotten relic. We had awoken something that had been waiting for millennia to be disturbed, and now it was too late to turn back. The words echoed through my mind, reverberating like a ringing bell that wouldn't stop. "You shouldn't have come." The figure that had spoken stepped forward, its form flickering and shifting in ways that defied the laws of nature. One moment it seemed humanoid, tall, gaunt, with a face half hidden in shadow, and the next, it blurred, becoming something more grotesque, more alien. It was like watching a dream dissolve into nightmare. I grabbed Ray's arm, trying to pull her away, but she didn't budge. Her eyes were fixed on the creature, her body trembling with the weight of the realization. This wasn't a warning. It was a judgment. "We need to go, Ray," I hissed, my voice hoarse. But even as I spoke, I knew it was pointless. We couldn't outrun them. Whatever they were no longer bound by the same rules that governed us. They had the advantage, and we were mere mortals trespassing on sacred ground. The cavern trembled again, and I felt a deep sense of dread wash over me as the shadows around us thickened, coalescing into more forms. There were dozens of them now, their bodies shifting, flickering like broken reflections in a cracked mirror. They seemed to be drawn to the artifact, their attention unwavering as they moved closer, their steps slow but deliberate. Ray's hand was clenched around my wrist, her nails digging into my skin. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "They've been waiting for us." I looked back at Adrian, still standing motionless before the artifact. He hadn't moved. His eyes were vacant, his expression almost serene. He was no longer the man I had known. He had become something else, something tied to the artifact, something that no longer belonged in this world. "Adrian!" I shouted, but he didn't respond. He was lost to whatever the artifact had awakened in him. Whatever power it had consumed him entirely. The creatures, if that's what they were getting closer. Their eyes, if they had eyes, glowed faintly in the low light like distant stars, cold and uncaring. There was no fear in their movements, no sense of urgency. They were patient, methodical, as though they had all the time in the universe. Ray grabbed my arm again, her grip desperate. "We have to move. Now." I tried to drag her toward the exit, but the ground beneath us shook again. The entire cavern felt like it was collapsing in on itself. The walls distorted, the ceiling rippling like liquid. Time itself seemed to bend, stretching, warping, and for a moment I was disoriented, unsure if we were still in the same place. Then, everything stopped. The hum, the shaking, the shadows, the creatures. It was all gone. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath came in sharp gasps. The world around us had returned to its eerie stillness, but the air felt wrong. It was thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere had changed. We were still in the cavern, but it wasn't the same. It had been altered, reshaped by whatever force had awoken beneath the moon's surface. And then, I saw it. Adrian was gone. In his place, there was nothing but a blackened, empty space where he had stood. The artifact's glow had dimmed, leaving only the faintest trace of light, like a dying ember. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "No." I ran forward, my feet slipping on the dusty ground as I reached the spot where he had been. But there was nothing, no sign of him, no trace that he had ever existed. It was as if he had been erased from the world entirely. The shadows, the creatures, the distortion, they were all gone. but something was still wrong. "We have to get out of here," Ray said, her voice trembling. I turned to face her, and for the first time since we'd uncovered the artifact, I saw fear in her eyes. Real, raw fear. "We can't go back to the base," I said, my voice low. "There's nothing left for us there." I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, that whatever we had awakened, whatever we had disturbed was still watching, still waiting. We hadn't escaped. We had only moved from one prison to another, and deep down, I knew the truth. The artifact had not only altered our reality, it had altered us. We were no longer the same. We were part of it now, bound to whatever it had unleashed. The cold weight of silence pressed in on us, deeper than the moon's surface, heavier than the dust that settled around us. I could hear my own breath, shallow and ragged, but that was the only sound in the cavern. The echoes of the growl that had once filled the air, the strange hum that seemed to shake the very bones of the moon were gone. But that didn't mean we were safe. I could still feel something watching us, something that had been awakened by our intrusion. It was still here. I could sense it, an oppressive presence hanging just out of reach, as if we were in a momentary reprieve before it came for us. I looked at Ray, whose pale face was illuminated by the faint, dying glow of the artifact. She was trembling, her eyes wide and fixed on the darkness beyond us. She was still holding on to me, as if afraid to let go, and I couldn't blame her. I felt it too, the terror, the realization that we had gone too far, done too much. We were no longer in control. We were at the mercy of whatever force had been lying dormant beneath the surface of this cold, lifeless world. "Do you think we're alone?" Ray asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if the question itself might provoke an answer. I didn't have to answer. We both knew the truth. The creatures, the shadows, the distorted beings that had appeared, they weren't just figments of our imaginations. They were real. And whatever had called them, whatever had controlled them, was still out there. We hadn't just uncovered a relic. We had opened a door to something older than time itself, something that had been waiting for us. "We need to leave," I said, my voice hoarse. I tried to ignore the gnawing panic rising in my chest, the overwhelming urge to flee. But it wasn't just fear that had gripped me. It was a certainty that we couldn't escape. Not now. "Where can we go?" Ray's voice trembled. "We've disturbed something. We're part of it now. There's no escaping this." I tried to steady my breath, to think, but all I could hear was the faint hum, like a heartbeat reverberating through the walls. It wasn't the artifact this time, it was something deeper, something that seemed to come from beneath the very bones of the moon. It felt like the entire place was alive, like the moon itself had awoken from a long slumber and we were trapped inside it. I wanted to run, I wanted to get back to the surface, to the safety of the ship, but I knew it wasn't enough. Even if we managed to escape this cavern, even if we made it to the surface, what then? What would we be returning to? Suddenly, a voice echoed through the cavern. It was low, guttural, and foreign, a language that made no sense, yet seemed to reverberate in the back of my skull. I couldn't understand the words, but I felt them. They were not meant for us. They were meant for something else, something that had been waiting in the shadows. The ground trembled beneath us again, and I felt a cold, oppressive pressure building in the air. I turned to Ray, who had already taken a step back, her eyes wide with terror. "We're not alone," she whispered, almost to herself. The figures were back, not the shadowy, distorted ones from before, but something else, something more solid, more real. They emerged from the walls, from the very stone itself, like liquid darkness taking shape. They were humanoid, but their movements were erratic, their limbs twisting unnaturally, like they didn't belong in this world. They had no faces, only hollow pits where their eyes should have been, and their mouths, if they had mouths, were hidden in the darkness, whispering words I couldn't understand. "We're not leaving," Ray said, her voice firm now, though I could see the fear in her eyes. "Not unless we do something." "Do something," I repeated, my voice rising. "What the hell are we supposed to do? We've disturbed something we can't even begin to understand. We can't fight them. We can't outrun them. We don't have a choice, she said, taking a step toward the artifact. There's got to be something we can do. I followed her, though every instinct in me screamed to run in the opposite direction. But we were trapped. The figures were closing in, their movements becoming faster, more deliberate. They were not just shadows now. They were real, and they were coming for us. Adrian was gone. The artifact had consumed him, turned him into something else, and now we were facing the consequences. I reached for the artifact, my fingers brushing the surface, and a shock ran through me, cold and sharp, like electricity. The artifact pulsed beneath my touch, as if recognizing my presence. The air grew heavier, more oppressive, and the shadows shifted again, growing longer, twisting toward us. We had awakened them, and now they were ready to claim us. The moment my hand touched the artifact, the world around me exploded into chaos. It was as if the very fabric of reality had split open. The walls of the cavern buckled and groaned, twisting like paper in a fire. The ground trembled violently beneath us, sending cracks spider-webbing across the stone floor. I could hear the creatures. No, they weren't creatures anymore. They were something beyond that, screeching, their voices tearing through the air like claws on glass. The walls shimmered, rippled, and for a moment I thought I might be falling into another dimension, a place where time and space no longer held meaning. The artifact pulsed with an intensity I had never felt before, sending waves of raw, unfiltered energy coursing through my body. My muscles seized up, my vision blurred, and for a moment, I could see nothing but white light, blinding and all-consuming. My thoughts fragmented, scattered like pieces of a broken puzzle, and I felt as though my mind was being pulled in 1,000 different directions at once. But then, the roar, returned. The hum that had filled the cavern, the hum that had drawn us here in the first place. It wasn't just sound anymore, it was alive, a living, breathing force that seemed to vibrate every atom of my being. Through the haze of light and sound, I saw Ray, her face pale, her body trembling, her eyes wide with fear. She was still standing, though barely, her hands clenched at her sides. "Get away from it," she screamed, but I couldn't hear her. Her words were lost in the cacophony that had consumed everything. The figures, the things that had emerged from the stone, were closer now. They were no longer flickering or shifting. They had solidified, taken on forms that could no longer be dismissed as mere illusions. They were real. And they were walking toward us. I tried to move, to step back, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen in place, my hand still pressed against the artifact. The energy it was emitting was unlike anything I had ever felt. Like a current, like electricity, but deeper, more primal, as though it were reaching into the very core of my being, pulling out everything that made me human. Ray was still moving, still trying to break free from the weight of the force that had gripped us. I could see the terror in her eyes, the desperation. "We can't survive this," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "We've triggered something we can't undo." I wanted to scream, to tell her that I knew, but the words wouldn't come. I had no voice, no control, only the overwhelming presence of the artifact, of whatever was reaching out through it, bending space and time. And then, in the midst of the madness, I understood. This wasn't just an artifact. It was a gate, a threshold to something else, a place where reality and non-reality collided, where time and space were no longer linear. This was a prison, a trap, and we had unwittingly opened it. The figures, the entities, were standing before us now, their forms shifting and warping with unnatural fluidity. They reached out, not with hands, but with tendrils of darkness that seemed to stretch and twist through the air like smoke, wrapping around us, pulling us toward them. The artifact was the key, and we had just unlocked the door, but we weren't meant to cross through it. We weren't meant to survive it. And then, the moment I had feared arrived. The world around us began to crumble. The cavern collapsed, the walls folding in on themselves, as if the moon itself was rejecting our presence. The energy from the artifact surged one final time, a blinding, all-encompassing flash that obliterated everything in its path. The figures, the creatures, were no longer walking toward us. They were here. They were inside the cavern with us, their presence overwhelming, filling every space, every shadow, every breath. I felt myself being pulled into the blackness, dragged by forces I couldn't comprehend. Ray was beside me, but her face was twisted with the same horror I felt. We were being consumed, torn apart, swallowed by the very thing we had awakened. And then, everything went dark. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold surface of the moon, the starlit sky above me untouched by the horrors that had occurred beneath it. The cavern was gone. The artifact was gone. But I wasn't the same. I couldn't remember how long I had been unconscious. I didn't know if it had been hours or days. My body ached, every muscle stiff and sore. But it was more than that. It was like I had been changed. Something had shifted inside me, deep within my mind, and I couldn't understand it. I tried to sit up, but the world around me was disorienting, unfamiliar. The landscape was barren, as it always had been, but the air felt different now. Thicker, heavier, like something had been left behind, something that would never be erased. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, but as I stood, it grew louder. A hum, the same hum. It wasn't from the artifact, it wasn't from the cavern. It was coming from somewhere else. From the depths of the moon, from beneath the surface. The pulse was still there, still waiting. It wasn't over. The artifact was gone, but its presence lingered. And somewhere, deep beneath the lunar surface, whatever had been awakened was still there, watching, waiting for the next fool to come. And I knew. I had become part of it. We all had. The cycle had begun again,